Welcome. Now, our story begins. Sit back, relax, and listen. If you enjoy calm, true crime stories, please follow the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let's begin. On the western edge of Washington State, where evergreen forests stretch toward distant mountains and rivers carve their way through quiet valleys, few people could have imagined that one of America's longest and most disturbing serial murder investigations was about to begin. In the early 1980s, the Seattle metropolitan area was growing rapidly. New neighborhoods appeared every year, industries expanded, and thousands of people moved to King County searching for opportunity. To most residents, it was a place of breathtaking natural beauty, a region surrounded by dense forests, snow-capped peaks, and the waters of Puget Sound. But hidden behind that peaceful image was another reality. Along stretches of Pacific Highway South, a busy road running through South King County, dozens of vulnerable young women worked the streets. Some had run away from difficult homes. Others struggled with addiction or poverty. Many hoped they would eventually escape the dangerous lives they had fallen into. Few realized that someone was watching them. In 1982, missing person reports involving young women began arriving with increasing frequency. At first, investigators treated each disappearance as an individual case. There was little evidence connecting them. Adults sometimes disappeared voluntarily, and many of the missing women lived unstable lives, making investigations especially difficult. Then everything changed. In July 1982, investigators searching near the Green River discovered human remains. Within days, more bodies were found in the same general area. Each discovery raised new questions. Detectives soon realized that these victims had not died by accident. They had been murdered. The similarities between the cases became impossible to ignore. Most of the victims were young women. Many had last been seen near the same stretch of highway. The cause of death was often strangulation. Their bodies had been left in secluded outdoor locations, suggesting the killer knew the area well. The media quickly gave the unknown murderer a name that would become infamous across the world: the Green River Killer. As news spread, fear gripped the Seattle area. Parents warned their children to stay close to home. Women altered their routines. Police agencies from across King County began sharing information, hoping to identify patterns that might reveal the killer's identity. The investigation rapidly expanded into one of the largest homicide investigations in American history. Hundreds of detectives, crime scene specialists, forensic experts, and analysts eventually worked on the case. Thousands of leads poured into police headquarters. Every telephone call had to be documented. Every possible witness interviewed. Every report carefully examined. The challenge facing investigators was enormous. Forensic science in the early 1980s was far less advanced than it is today. DNA profiling was not yet available as an investigative tool. Surveillance cameras were rare. Mobile phones did not exist in everyday life, leaving detectives to rely on witness testimony, fingerprints, fibers, tire tracks, and physical evidence collected from crime scenes. Meanwhile, the killer continued living among ordinary people. He blended into the community so completely that no one suspected the quiet man going about his daily routine might one day be revealed as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Months turned into years. More victims were discovered in wooded areas, along riverbanks, and in remote locations throughout King County. Some were found by hikers, others by construction crews or hunters. In several cases, skeletal remains were all that investigators recovered. Each discovery represented another family receiving devastating news. Behind every headline was a daughter, a sister, a friend, or a mother whose life had ended in unimaginable violence. Investigators worked tirelessly to identify the victims, notify relatives, and search for connections that might finally expose the man responsible. They interviewed thousands of people and examined countless suspects, yet the investigation repeatedly reached dead ends. One name, however, appeared more than once during the early years of the investigation: Gary Leon Ridgeway. He was a truck painter from the Seattle area who admitted to occasionally picking up sex workers. Witnesses had reported seeing him with some of the missing women. Detectives interviewed him, searched for inconsistencies in his statements, and kept his name in their files. But suspicion alone was not enough. Without conclusive forensic evidence, investigators could not prove that Ridgeway had committed the murders. The case remained open, and the killings continued to cast a shadow over Washington state. No one realized that the answer had already crossed paths with detectives. It would take more than 2 decades and remarkable advances in forensic science before the truth finally emerged. Long before the name Gary Ridgeway became known around the world, he was simply another face in the suburbs south of Seattle. He worked a steady job as a truck painter, lived an outwardly ordinary life, and rarely attracted attention. To neighbors and co-workers, he appeared quiet, polite, and dependable. Nothing about his daily routine suggested that he would eventually be linked to one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history. Gary Leon Ridgeway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. During his childhood, his family later moved to Washington state, where he spent most of his youth. By many accounts, his early years were troubled. His parents argued frequently, and he later described having a difficult relationship with his mother. Those who studied his life after his arrest often pointed to these experiences, but investigators have always stressed an important fact. Many people experience unhappy childhoods without becoming violent criminals. There is no single explanation for why Ridgeway became a murderer. As a teenager, Ridgeway struggled academically and was described as having below-average intelligence. He eventually graduated from high school and later served in the United States Navy during the late 1960s. After completing his military service, he returned to Washington and began building what appeared to be a normal adult life. He married, started working, and eventually found long-term employment as a truck painter. He held that job for decades, earning a reputation as a reliable employee. Co-workers later recalled that he rarely stood out. He wasn't the loudest person in the room or someone who constantly sought attention. In many ways, he seemed completely ordinary. That ordinary appearance would become one of his greatest advantages. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Seattle and the surrounding communities were changing rapidly. Population growth brought new businesses, expanding highways, and increasing social challenges. Along Pacific Highway South, sex work became increasingly visible. The area attracted people looking for quick money, but it also attracted violent offenders who viewed vulnerable women as easy targets. When the first victims disappeared, detectives initially had very little to work with. Missing persons investigations are often difficult, especially when adults are involved. Some victims had left home before. Others struggled with addiction or unstable housing. Investigators had to determine whether each disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or the result of a crime. Everything changed when bodies began to appear. The discovery of multiple victims confirmed investigators' worst fears. A serial killer was operating in King County. As the number of victims increased, detectives searched for any common thread connecting them. Witnesses described seeing certain women entering vehicles shortly before they vanished. Some remembered pickup trucks. Others remembered ordinary passenger cars. The descriptions varied, making it almost impossible to identify one suspect. Ridgeway's name entered the investigation surprisingly early. Several witnesses reported that they had seen him with women who later disappeared. Ridgeway himself admitted that he had picked up sex workers in the past. While this immediately caught investigators' attention, it was not enough to charge him with murder. At the time, there was no forensic evidence linking him directly to the killings. Detectives interviewed him extensively. They searched for contradictions. They compared his statements with witness accounts. But every lead seemed to stop just short of proving his guilt. Like many investigations before the age of modern DNA analysis, the Green River case relied heavily on physical evidence that could easily be overlooked or could not yet be scientifically analyzed. Detectives preserved clothing, biological samples, hair, fibers, and other evidence, hoping that future advances might one day reveal answers. Meanwhile, the murders continued. The killer appeared confident. He selected isolated locations to leave victims' bodies, often returning to familiar areas. This pattern suggested that he knew the landscape well and felt comfortable moving through it without attracting attention. Investigators slowly realized they were hunting someone who understood police procedures, carefully minimized the evidence he left behind, and blended effortlessly into everyday society. Years passed. The Green River Task Force grew larger. Hundreds of officers worked thousands of leads. Millions of dollars were spent. Yet the man many detectives privately suspected continued living his ordinary life only a short drive away. The investigation had become a race against time. Would the killer make a mistake? Or would science eventually catch up with him? For years, no one knew the answer. By the mid-1980s, the Green River investigation had become unlike anything law enforcement in Washington state had experienced before. What had begun as a series of missing persons reports had evolved into a massive operation involving hundreds of investigators from multiple agencies. Every new lead was documented. Every witness statement was reviewed. Yet despite years of work, the identity of the killer remained a mystery. The scale of the investigation was staggering. Thousands of tips poured into the task force. Detectives interviewed relatives, friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have crossed paths with the victims. Search teams combed forests, riverbanks, abandoned lots, and remote logging roads. Helicopters surveyed wooded areas from above, while divers searched rivers and lakes below. Each discovery brought both answers and heartbreak. Families who had spent months, or even years, hoping their daughters might still be alive, instead faced the devastating reality that they had become victims of a serial killer. For many parents, the uncertainty ended only when investigators identified skeletal remains found far from where their loved ones had last been seen. The emotional weight of the investigation affected everyone involved. Experienced detectives later described the case as one of the most exhausting of their careers. They attended funerals, comforted grieving families, and returned again and again to crime scenes that offered few new clues. Every victim represented another life cut short and another reminder that the killer was still free. Although the murders appeared random, investigators slowly recognized clear patterns. Most victims disappeared after being seen along Pacific Highway South, an area known for street prostitution during the early 1980s. The killer seemed comfortable approaching strangers without causing alarm. Witnesses who survived encounters with suspicious customers often described polite, soft-spoken men who did not initially appear threatening. That observation created a troubling possibility. The Green River Killer might not fit the public's image of a violent criminal. Instead of behaving aggressively, he may have relied on appearing trustworthy. Investigators also noticed that many victims had been left in wooded locations that required local knowledge to reach. Some sites were hidden behind dense vegetation or located near little-used service roads. These were not places someone unfamiliar with the area would likely choose. The offender appeared patient, organized, careful. He avoided unnecessary risks and left remarkably little physical evidence behind. During those years, detectives developed psychological profiles in an attempt to better understand the unknown killer. While profiles could never identify a suspect by themselves, they suggested that the offender was probably familiar with the area, capable of maintaining ordinary employment, and skilled at hiding his violent behavior from those around him. As investigators continued their work, Gary Ridgway's name never completely disappeared from the files. He had been interviewed. His background had been examined. Witnesses had connected him to women who later disappeared. Yet none of those facts proved he had committed murder. Investigators found themselves trapped by the limitations of the era. Modern DNA profiling had not yet become the powerful investigative tool it would later become. Biological evidence collected from crime scenes was carefully preserved, but the science needed to analyze it simply did not exist in a practical form. The evidence waited, stored in sealed containers inside police evidence rooms, year after year, waiting for technology to catch up. Meanwhile, public attention slowly shifted elsewhere. News coverage became less frequent. Many people assumed the killer had died, moved away, or stopped killing altogether. The investigation remained active, but as time passed, fewer headlines appeared on television or in newspapers. For the families of the victims, however, nothing had ended. Birthdays came and went. Holidays passed with empty chairs at the dinner table. Parents grew older without knowing whether justice would ever be served. Detectives refused to abandon the case. Even when active leads disappeared, they continued reviewing evidence, organizing files, and preserving every piece of material that might one day become important. That decision would prove critical. Years later, advances in forensic science transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Techniques that had once seemed impossible became routine. Tiny traces of biological material, evidence too small or too degraded to analyze during the early 1980s, could now reveal identities with extraordinary accuracy. The Green River Task Force realized that their decades-old evidence deserved another look. Samples collected years earlier were submitted for modern testing. Investigators hoped for a miracle. They did not yet know that the answers they had searched for across 2 decades were hidden inside evidence that had been sitting quietly in storage all along. For the first time in years, the investigation began moving forward again. Science was about to succeed where thousands of interviews, searches, and surveillance operations had failed. The quiet man who had blended into everyday life for so long would soon find that time had finally run out. For nearly 20 years, the Green River investigation remained open. Boxes filled with photographs, maps, laboratory reports, witness interviews, and forensic evidence lined police storage rooms. Detectives retired. New investigators joined the task force. Yet the case never disappeared. Every piece of evidence was carefully preserved in the hope that future technology might reveal what investigators of the 1980s could not. That decision would eventually change everything. During the late 1990s, DNA analysis had advanced dramatically. Techniques that were once impossible had become reliable enough to identify suspects from extremely small biological samples. Across the United States, cold cases that had remained unsolved for decades were suddenly being reopened. The Green River investigation became one of them. Evidence collected years earlier was sent back to the laboratory. Scientists carefully examined biological material that had been preserved since the murders. Unlike detectives, DNA did not rely on memory, assumptions, or witness testimony. It compared genetic profiles with extraordinary precision. As the results began to arrive, investigators saw something they had hoped for, but scarcely expected. Several samples pointed toward the same individual, Gary Leon Ridgeway, the quiet truck painter whose name had appeared in the investigation years earlier, was once again at the center of attention. This time, however, detectives possessed something they had never had before: physical evidence that could be scientifically tested and independently verified. The investigation immediately intensified. Rather than rushing to make an arrest, detectives quietly watched Ridgway's daily routine. Surveillance teams documented his movements. Investigators reviewed old witness statements, employment records, and evidence collected throughout the previous 2 decades. They wanted every detail to be as complete as possible before taking the next step. By now, Ridgeway had continued living what appeared to be a normal life. He still held a steady job. He lived with his wife. Neighbors saw nothing unusual. Few could imagine that one of the country's most wanted serial killers might be living just down the street. To investigators, however, the picture was becoming increasingly clear. In November 2001, after years of waiting, detectives finally moved. Gary Ridgway was arrested and charged with 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder involving victims whose deaths had been linked to DNA evidence. For the families who had waited decades for answers, the arrest marked the first real sign that justice might finally be possible. News spread rapidly across the country. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Newspapers carried the story on their front pages. For many people, the arrest came as a shock. Some remembered the Green River murders vividly from the 1980s. Others had assumed the killer would never be identified. The investigation, however, was far from over. Although prosecutors now had strong evidence connecting Ridgway to several murders, detectives believed the true number of victims was much higher. Years of investigation had suggested a pattern extending far beyond the original charges. The challenge facing prosecutors was enormous. If the case proceeded to trial, it could take years to present evidence from dozens of separate homicide investigations. Families might be forced to relive painful memories through lengthy court proceedings. Some victims had never even been found. Eventually, prosecutors reached an agreement. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to plead guilty and cooperate fully with investigators. Most importantly, he agreed to identify victims and describe crimes that had remained unsolved for years. The agreement was not without controversy. Some family members believed the death penalty was appropriate given the scale of the crimes. Others felt that learning the truth about missing loved ones was more important than pursuing an execution that might never occur because of decades of appeals. For investigators, the decision offered something they had sought for years: answers. During countless interviews, Ridgway described how he selected many of his victims. He admitted targeting women whom he believed were less likely to be reported missing quickly, or whose disappearances might receive less public attention. Detectives compared his statements with evidence collected over 2 decades, carefully verifying details whenever possible. Not every claim could be confirmed. Some locations had changed dramatically over the years. Natural erosion had altered landscapes. Construction projects had transformed remote areas into neighborhoods and highways. Even so, Ridgeway's information led investigators to additional remains, allowing several families to finally learn what had happened to their loved ones. Each discovery represented another chapter closing after years of uncertainty. The investigation had entered a new phase. The mystery of the killer's identity was over. Now, detectives faced a different task: documenting the full scale of the crimes and ensuring that every identifiable victim received a name, a history, and the dignity that had been taken from them decades earlier. For the Green River Task Force, science had finally succeeded where time, interviews, and countless searches had failed. But the most difficult part of the story was still to come. The confessions would reveal the staggering scope of one of the deadliest serial murder cases in American history. Following Gary Ridgway's arrest, investigators entered a phase unlike any they had experienced before. For nearly 20 years, they had searched for an unknown killer, following fragments of evidence across forests, rivers, highways, and forgotten crime scenes. Now, for the first time, they were sitting across the table from the man they believed was responsible. The interviews lasted for months. Detectives approached each meeting with careful preparation. Every question was designed to verify facts already known, challenge inconsistencies, and recover information that only the killer could have known. They compared Ridgway's statements with maps, forensic reports, witness interviews, and evidence preserved since the early 1980s. Again and again, details matched. As the interviews continued, investigators realized they were documenting crimes that stretched across many years. Ridgway admitted responsibility for dozens of murders, explaining that he had often targeted women he believed were especially vulnerable. Many had disappeared without immediate public attention, a fact he believed reduced the likelihood that police would quickly connect the cases. His admissions confirmed what detectives had long suspected. The Green River murders had never been a series of isolated crimes. They were part of a sustained pattern carried out over years by a man who had hidden behind an ordinary life. One of the investigators later described the interviews as emotionally exhausting. Each confession represented another family whose worst fears had become reality. Detectives understood that behind every case file was a person with dreams, relationships, and loved ones who had spent decades searching for answers. As Ridgway continued cooperating, he identified areas where he had left victims' remains. Search teams returned to forests, ravines, and remote hillsides, carefully examining locations that had changed dramatically since the 1980s. Trees had grown, roads had been expanded, entire neighborhoods now stood where wilderness had once existed. Even so, investigators recovered additional remains in several locations. For some families, the discoveries finally ended years of uncertainty. Although nothing could erase the loss they had suffered, being able to lay a loved one to rest provided a measure of closure that had seemed impossible for decades. The legal proceedings moved forward with equal care. Rather than taking the case to a lengthy capital trial, prosecutors accepted Ridgway's guilty pleas in exchange for his continued cooperation. The agreement meant he would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision was difficult. Some relatives believed justice demanded a death sentence. Others believed learning the truth mattered more than a punishment that might have delayed answers through years of appeals. There was no outcome capable of repairing the lives that had been destroyed. The court proceedings focused not only on the crimes themselves, but also on restoring the identities of the victims. During the years when the murders occurred, many had been known to the public only through brief newspaper headlines or missing person notices. Investigators worked to ensure that each woman was remembered as an individual rather than simply another number connected to a serial killer. Their stories revealed lives interrupted far too soon. Some had hoped to return to school. Some dreamed of rebuilding relationships with their families. Others were young mothers whose children grew up without them. Those personal histories reminded investigators and the public that the Green River case was never simply about one offender. It was about dozens of lives forever changed. As the investigation concluded, detectives also reflected on what the case had taught future generations of law enforcement. The preservation of evidence had proven critical. The patience of investigators had mattered. Most importantly, advances in forensic science demonstrated that even decades-old cases could eventually be solved. The Green River investigation became an example studied by police agencies around the world. It showed that justice can be delayed for years, but careful evidence collection and scientific progress may eventually reveal answers that once seemed impossible to obtain. Yet one question has never been answered with certainty. Exactly how many people did Gary Ridgway kill? He confessed to 48 murders, making him one of the most prolific convicted serial killers in United States history. Investigators have long believed the true number may be higher, though many cases can never be confirmed because evidence has disappeared with time, or victims have never been found. That uncertainty remains one of the darkest aspects of the case. Some families are still waiting, some victims remain unidentified, and some questions may never receive complete answers. Even so, the Green River investigation transformed modern homicide investigations. It demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, continuing cold case reviews, and refusing to abandon cases simply because years have passed. For the detectives who spent much of their careers searching for the Green River Killer, the case was never about fame or headlines. It was about giving names back to the victims and ensuring that, after decades of silence, the truth could finally be heard.